So I used to teach math. I taught math to A-level students for a long time. And one of the things that I experienced as I taught math was you could give a very good lecture to students. Even students could tell you that they understood the material really well. At least that's what they said. But when you test them afterwards, they could reproduce everything that you taught in the lecture, but if you change a little bit of the content or the parameters, it was as though they didn't learn anything at all, right? So when I started my PhD, I started looking at research as to why that happens. And this is almost 4 decades ago. Research that came out of Berkeley, as titled the Disasters of Well-Taught Mathematics Courses. Here, researchers went into the classrooms of well-known, well-taught math courses, had the same phenomena where if you were to experience that lecture, it would be a very good lecture by all accounts, from students, from peers, and so on and so forth. Yet, when you tested understanding of students' concepts after the lecture, they were found a little wanting. So the problem that I started to work on back in graduate school, and I continue to do so, is not that we learn poorly from bad lectures. So please do not give bad lectures. The problem really is that we learn poorly from very good ones. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but the cognitive architecture is such that we can't seem to make sense of even information that is very well designed and delivered. Why is that the case, right? So I don't have a lot of time to go into everything, but one of the things that I want to focus on is this notion of seeing things, right? You've got to see things so that you can encode it and encode it deeply, right? So imagine you're in a movie, you're watching a movie rather. Yeah, you're in the cinema, you're watching a movie. Imagine the person sitting next to you is an acclaimed director, somebody who's an expert in making movies. The movie's really entertaining, very engaging, you love it, you come out and I ask you a question. Did you see what the director saw? At this point, you should be turning your heads like that, because the correct answer to this question is no. And in fact, decades of research comparing experts versus novices show very clearly that given the same stimulus, experts in a domain will see very different things from novices. Experts tend to see the deep structure, novices tend to see the superficial structure. Experts also see things differently that allow them to make sense of the stimulus that's being presented. So what this suggests is that seeing, as it may be obvious by now, is not simply a perceptual exercise. It is actually a cognitive exercise. And in the context of learning something new, that creates a bit of a paradox. Because if you really want to learn or understand something deeply, you need to be able to see the deep structure, the deep features. Yet precisely by virtue of you being a novice or your students being a novice to the domain, they don't have the knowledge to see it. So how do you get around this paradox in the context of teaching or learning something new? Right? And failure has a story there, a mechanism there. Then people have studied children, because in the developmental years, those are our steepest learning curves, right? So children who love to play toys, and people have studied how do children play with toys. Now imagine for a moment your kids, 3 to 5 year olds, who love to play with toys. Suppose I divide you into 2 groups. On my left is group 1, and on my right is group 2. I come to group 1 and say, hey kids, here's a new toy, just pretend please, right? here's a new toy. You've never seen it, you've never played with it. Would you like to play with it? Okay. Yeah. You've been waiting for a while, so you're excused. Okay. All right, so I say, all right, I give you the toy and play as you like. Try to figure out how it works, play as you like. And then I go to group 2 and I say, here's a new toy, same toy. You've never seen it, you've never played with it. Would you like to play with it? Okay, equally enthusiastic, right? And so I say, no, but look, you've never seen it, so let me show you how to play with this toy. Watch and learn, so you watch and learn, and then I give you the toy and say, now play as you like, figure out how it works. Who do you think which group would you think would be more engaged with the toy? The first one. Who would be more creative in inventing strategies to figure out how it works? First one. In fact, research suggests that those strategies mirror the scientific method, in fact. In fact, and so it's pretty interesting that these kids on the group 1 can be almost 3 times as creative as those in group 2, even though the ones in group 2 had more knowledge about how the toy actually works. Think about that, right? Now think about concepts and ideas as things that are not, tangible toys, but perhaps conceptual toys, right? And part of learning and creativity and thinking is about tinkering and playing. But part of how we design, or much of how we design teaching and learning in schools, in higher education institutions, tends to be, I don't know, whether it's group 1 or group 2, you decide, right? Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to go and kind of give you a sense of an example of what productive failure is. And productive failure is the idea that if you just keep to group 1, people are not going to figure out everything by themselves, because they'll play a lot, they'll tinker and fail, but they will not figure out how the thing works, right? Group 2 is kind of an advantage from the sense of knowing what the correct way of doing things is, right? But that also boxes them up. So the part of the logic of productive failure is very simply, we can see from a number of studies that if we make mistakes, if we explore and tinker, even if we don't get to the correct solutions or correct answers, that prepares us to learn. There's some magic in there. The question is, how do we extract that? How do we deliberately design for it? And that's how I came up with this model, a 2-phase design, productive failure. So before any instruction, so when you're learning something new, before any instruction, we engage students in problem-solving activities that are designed in a way that you will be able to do something with it, but whatever you do is not going to lead you to a correct solution. In fact, that is not even the goal. The goal is just to explore, just like group 1. And once you've done that, that's when a teacher or an expert can come in and assemble. Okay, so I'll give you an example. We go into a math classroom at the high school, right? So target concept for today, for example, is standard deviation. The kids are going to learn this new concept in their classrooms as part of the curriculum, standard deviation. Now, a teacher may come in and say, well, here's 3 football players, here's the number of goals they've scored over the years. Can you calculate the standard deviation of each of the strikers? And students would go, I've never heard of this. This is new to me. What do you want me to do? And chances are they will do nothing. They'll just, shrug. But if you ask them another way, you say, well, same data, invent as many ways of deciding who's the most consistent player. Now you're looking at something else. What do you think students would do? Remember, they've not learned this concept yet. Sorry? Well, if they could do that within a 20, 30-minute class period, you don't have to teach this a bunch of kids anymore. No, but remember, they have not learned it yet. Yes, in previous or prior to this concept, they may have learned other mathematics in the curriculum. So what would they do if they don't even know what this concept is? Sorry? Mean, range. What else? Highest number, lowest number. Yes, maybe interquartile range, yes. If they've learned it before this, yeah. Any last ideas?
Does it have to be the consistently best?
Well, that's an interesting thing. They'll ask what's consistency. Sometimes you have to have the discussion where, if you're a straight F student, you're very consistent compared to somebody who scores A's and B's. Right, but that's a valid point as well. All right, so I'm going to show you some data as to what students typically do. And this is quite representative across 4 different continents, thousands of students. Quite remarkable. But in some way, math is math, so people think like that. So yes, they do totals, they do means, they do medians, they do modes. But we know that they're going to use that knowledge gets activated, but we keep it invariant. We keep it the same so that they try it, and they see, oh, everything's the same. It doesn't work. Let me try something else. Okay? They do tallying, they do box plots, they do the interquartile range. They're getting a feel of the problem, just like group 1 playing with the toys. And they draw graphs. So you say, what are you doing here? And they say, oh, if it goes up and down. It's a very intuitive layperson language to try to figure out, what's going on in the distribution. And if it fluctuates a lot, it's more inconsistent. So the question is, can you be more precise? Can you mathematize it? They take the lowest and the highest, they take the range. We know they're going to take the range. It's very intuitive. So again, the evil part of productive failure says, keep it invariant, so the method doesn't work. So that's part of the kind of the design feature as well, where you anticipate the priors, and then you make the problem not solvable by the prior, so they have to invent something else. They take year-on-year differences, not from the average, just year-on-year, because that's intuitive. The leap to taking the difference from the average is quite a big conceptual leap, which almost never happens, right? And some of them recognize that, large fluctuations are canceling each other out, which is not fair, and therefore let's ignore the signs altogether. So no technical language like take absolute deviations, just let's ignore the signs. And sometimes these crazy, amazing things happen where we pushed a group of students to be more precise with their calculations of who's the most inconsistent or who's the most consistent when they drew this graph. And they said, imagine we could hold the ends of the graph. And imagine we could extend the graph into a rope. And now imagine we could calculate the length of that rope. Right? The longer the rope, the more inconsistent. They've broken it down into right-angle triangles. Pythagoras, if you remember, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, calculated the hypotenuses, the lengths, and there you go, you have a solution. To this day, I've never bothered to check if the computation is correct. It's been almost 15, 20 years for this, right? So, because the real mathematics is not in the computation, it's in the play of imagination, right? And I think that's the key. And all of this is happening in a carefully designed exploration generation space with problems that are designed based on certain features, that students can generate these kinds of representations and solutions. All do not lead to the canonical solution that we know for standard deviation. The question is this of any use? Is this deliberate design for failure, but with exploration? Is this of any use? And therefore we put it to a test. And the test goes very, very generically, something like this. We run experiments where we compare direct instruction, which is basically group 2, right? You don't know the stuff, I'll tell you, I'll explain it to you in good ways, so good lectures followed by problem solving. And productive failure, which is kind of the inversion where you do the same problem, but you attempt the problem first, and then after that you get the instruction based on it. Okay? And what we find that both methods, productive failure and direct instruction, are very good, very efficient, and achieving high levels of basic knowledge fluency. So people do get the stuff. But when it comes to conceptual understanding, how deeply you understand the material, how well you can transfer it to novel contexts, like, for example, if you want to figure out who's a better champion, Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps, the swimmer, how do you do that? The transfer capabilities of productive failure students are a lot better. Okay. And initial results have been replicated. It's been almost 15 to 20 years of this research. Other labs have replicated this work around the world. And based on 160 odd experiments, the average effect in favor of productive failure over direct instruction is pretty moderate, pretty good, 0.36, given with respect to what one can achieve in an education setting. And if you can design it to high fidelity, because this is not just about giving any problem solving, it's designed based on certain principles. So if you can design it to high fidelity, the effect sizes are pretty nice, 0.6 almost. What that means that if you were to learn with a good teacher using direct instruction, and if you could quantify that as 1 unit learning gain over the year, and if they were to switch to productive failure with high fidelity, you could do up to 3 times of that effect, right? And although my work, because of my interest in mathematics and love for mathematics, has been in mathematical cognition, the work has since also been replicated and translated into other domains, but it's growing. Right. Why does it work the way it works? So here are the broad sort of umbrella of mechanisms that we've experimented with, we've done research on, to try to explain why this effect comes about. So first major umbrella mechanism is activation. We all process new information based on what we already know. So while you're processing information, the more relevant knowledge that can be activated, that you already have from your long-term memory, the easier it becomes to make sense of the incoming information. Right? So people who know a little bit more math will make more from the same lecture than people who know a little bit less. Right? So activation is key. And what we do in productive failure is we deliberately do the activation based on this failure protocol. So the cognitive system is activated because then that also develops an awareness that I tried to solve this problem in a number of ways. I couldn't, so here's what I know. But there is this thing that I don't know, and there's a gap between what I do and what I don't know. Right? And that gap, just the awareness of that gap is a very strong mechanism. Because what we want to do, having invested effort in something and there still being a gap, the psychology is that you want to close that gap. And that brings about affect. And affect both in positive ways and also in negative ways. In the positive ways, when we studied, if you look at interest in finding out what the correct solution is, that's much better, much greater, significantly greater for productive failure students. The engagement in the lecture is much greater. The orientation towards the lecture or the instruction that follows is one of, why is your solution better than mine? So they really want to understand in those comparisons between what they generated and what the expert solutions are. What are those, what are the critical features? And that's what helps you see. Remember the problem of seeing earlier. That's exactly what helps you see the differences. And that's what leads to deep understanding. So those are the positive affects. They're motivated to learn, they're engaged. But there's also negative affect. Because if you try something and it doesn't work, and then you have to try something else and it still doesn't work. And yet again, so although it's a safe space within which we do this, we tell students that you're not expected to get the correct answer. Still, if you try a few times and things don't work, you get frustrated. There's a bit of stress. We've also studied the emotional roller coaster that students go through in real time using machine learning techniques. And we found that episodes of positive emotions are interlaced with episodes of negative emotions like shame and guilt. But the interesting part is that not all positive emotions are positively predictive of learning. And not all negative ones are negatively predictive of learning. We found that some level of stress, frustration, feeling guilt and shame can actually be positively predictive of learning within the safe productive failure experiences. Right? And there's a lot more work in this domain, in the affective domain that's going on, because historically that's been neglected. So imagine now if you're a student or a learner, your cognitive system has been activated, you're aware that there's a knowledge gap, and then you have this very powerfully charged affective state, both positive and negative, that kind of primes you. And if at that point in time a teacher or an expert comes and assembles it together and puts it all together, much like you might put together Lego blocks, then that assembly is what creates, what makes, or what turns the initial failure into something that is productive. Right? So that's what productive failure is. I would just add that these mechanisms are not just particular to productive failure. In any learning situations, there is no other choice for you but to activate what you know to make sense of the new information. So activation is going on right now, even if this is just a lecture. The question is, what is the strength and the nature of the activation that is different between productive failure and other learning situations? If you go into a new lecture, you go in knowing, today I'm going to learn something new. So there is an awareness that, at a general level, yes, I will learn something new today. So there is an awareness. There may be interest and motivation to attend that lecture, maybe some anxiety as well. So the affect state is also there, and the teacher will come in and assemble. So all of these mechanisms are always available or always there in learning situations. The question is, the way they are designed for and invoked, the degree, their strength, their nature is different. And that's what defines the effectiveness of one learning design over the other. It's much like any car you build. would have to obey laws of mechanics and thermodynamics. But there's a difference in between a Ferrari and a Volvo in the ways in which those have been invoked, right? Because they optimize different things. All right. So in the final analysis, I just want to disambiguate this notion of learning from performance, right? And we're used to thinking of, we normally conflate the two quite a bit, but imagine a 2x2 where you have learning, deep and shallow, or high and low, and you have performance, where you can visibly see what's happening, low and high. There are cases where, there's very low performance, and that leads to low learning. This typically happens when you throw people in the deep end, go discover things by yourself. That is not a terribly good way to learn new things, okay? At least not in an instructional setting. And that's what we call unproductive failure. There are cases where learning and performance are very tightly aligned. This is typically seen in experts who know a lot, and they're in new novel situations and they can perform very well. So that's like the flow zone of experts. That's productive success. Perhaps that's what we want eventually, all the development of expertise to lead to productive success. I've shown you a case very quickly, very briefly, about productive failure, where initially there is struggle. It's not leading to a successful solution. So the performance is low, but the locus of deep learning is right there. And that's what productive failure is about. Higher deep learning in low performance. But the biggest beast that we really have to slay or work to tackle is this idea of unproductive success, which is really the illusion of learning in high performance. Whether it's in the way that we teach, whether it's in the way we use tools, for example, AI, to do much of the work, it's the illusion of learning in high performance. And if it's leading to unproductive success, then that's something that we need to really, really figure out how to tackle. With that, I think my 20 minutes are probably over. 23, I'm sorry. I'm on the late side today. It's one of those afternoons, but thank you for your patience, and love to take comments and questions. Thank you.
How do you get to a point of caring so much about failure personally? You know where I'm coming from.
Yeah. The dots connect looking back as we...
Tell me about the dots.
Yeah, so I was born in India, a land where people play cricket, right? That's something you might know a little bit about in England, the game of cricket. And I loved football, which is another game that you guys know about. But I grew up playing football. I wanted to be a professional football player. I moved to Singapore to play football. And I played it until I broke my knee, 4 surgeries on, and that was a career that was ended. That was like around 20. Then I finished up my engineering course. By the time I was done with engineering, that too was not something that I figured I wanted to do in life. I went into the startup world. This was .com boom of the new millennium, late 90s, if you might. Some of you look like you might know, right? We definitely know. Had a couple of startups. Had a couple of startups. The .com magic became .com tragic pretty quickly. And then I was broke and I started teaching, purely out of survival, right? I started teaching kids math in high school in a poor income neighborhood in Singapore. Yes, we do have them. And and I fell in love with, obviously math was one of my favorite subjects. I was fairly okay with it, but I really fell in love with teaching, the idea of mathematical cognition itself. And, I was almost touching 30, 28, 29. I tried football, I tried engineering, startups, teaching. Everything in the real world that I touched didn't seem to work for me. So I decided what a rational person, any rational person would do. I decided to become an academic. And looking back, all of those failures have been pretty, in the moment when you experience them, it's not nice, but looking back, I think all of that in some weird way drives you to think about life and phenomena in a particular way that makes failure more salient, and the next thing you know, you're researching failure.
And you talked there about high-risk failure and low-risk failure.
Yeah.
By all means, fail at low risk early because there's less of an involvement. Your first failure then was a high-risk one because you had committed yourself to a life where you were going to play football and now it's no longer there. That surely is a real challenge for any person, but a young person, to be able to overcome. How did you rationalize that failure in your own mind?
I was depressed pretty much for 10 years of my life. My 20s was. So it's incredibly hard to rationalize. Even today, it's like when you crumple, I talk about it in the book, it's like you crumple paper up, right? You can, yes, flatten it out, but the creases are going to remain forever. It's like that. So I don't wish upon that kind of failure on anybody. So I don't have an answer as to how do you rationalize. It's just life. It's just how it is. But if you can give, and I also didn't have the toolkit to deal with it as a teenager.
Age brings some of that.
Yeah. And when repeated failures like that are not within your control, that just life will throw at you happen, over time, the thing that happens is you learn that you will be okay in the end. Right? So every subsequent failure, even though it was not designed intentionally in any way, you go through it, but each time gets a little bit easier because you know you'll go through it and you'll get over it, or you get past it at least and come out stronger.
And how do we persuade people then to embrace failure? Because we are a culture that by and large rejects failure and sees it as a failure rather than seeing it as an opportunity. How do we change that culture, or can we change that culture?
We absolutely can. We are changing that culture. The way to change it is, I guess, in the answer that we don't treat failure as one thing. It's okay to say that certain kinds of failures are not desirable, of the kinds that we just talked about in exams, in life, that they're not desirable. So let's be frank about it. But there are other kinds of failures that are actually good. In fact, if you look at basic learning and growth models, by definition, the only way to learn and grow is to put yourself in a zone where your current skill sets and abilities are not sufficient. Right? Because if you're always doing things that you can already do, then you're not learning or growing. You're just in that zone, safe space. The way to grow is to take on something that is beyond your current skill sets and abilities. And if you do that, you will struggle, you will fail. If you want to learn how to swim, you've got to get into the pool and it's going to be painful. You've got to learn how to play football, it's going to be painful, right? So it's that idea that, okay, let's talk about different failures. Let's say some failures are not okay, but when they happen, let's have the support systems to deal with it. But other kinds of failures are actually desirable. And in fact, if you don't have those failures, then you're not learning and growing. And this is what I call, actually, I ask people, both my PhD students and everybody I meet, what's your failure signal? If you can't describe to me where is failure in your life, again, not failure out of laziness, incompetence, stupidity, not failure that life just throws at you, but the failure signal. If you can't describe where the things that you're struggling with, the things that you're really finding challenging and you're still at it, then you're not learning and growing. So find your failure signal is what it's the conversation that I want to have with people. Describe your failure signal. Maybe not to others, but at least to yourself. Here are my good failure signals. And if you don't find any failure signals, you're not learning, which may also be a comfortable space, but that's your space to be.
It's challenging as well to know, isn't it, when to let something fail? Because there is a tendency to just keep going, because if I just keep going a little bit longer, it will succeed. How do you navigate that space between making the decision that something, we have to let it fail because it would be productive to fail, or just keeping going that little bit longer?
And the latter could be also very dangerous, right? If you just overdo it. I think Kahneman talks about that as well, the loss aversion, right? Because you've invested so much, you just hold on to that without pivoting at all. So that can be dangerous. From a learning standpoint, I just think of it as a minimum threshold function. The goal is not to go all the way and, till the end. It's just, if you want to learn something new, I think just thinking about 3, 4, 5 different conceptions and ideas and representations usually is enough to get sufficient activation, sufficient awareness, powerful affect for you to then prepare to learn. Now, whether those threshold functions translate in life I think that's what individual differences are made up of, right? You might push on for a little bit longer than me, and there I do not know how to modulate, really.
And those that you see, particularly in the entrepreneurial world, who will fail, pick themselves up, fail again, pick themselves up, fail. You know, I have a very dear friend who says he's a much better millionaire now than he was 3 times ago when he was bankrupt.
Yeah.
You know, simply because there is almost an addiction in the entrepreneur in some ways that is more confident. Perhaps confidence and failure are 2 things that are quite usefully interlinked.
Yeah. I think you have to balance 2 things, right? A is tenacity to persist,
Yeah.
and knowing when to pivot. And I don't think there's a science
There's no
that
rule.
tells you, there's no
No.
rule per se. And
No.
I guess you just get better at it as you experience more
more
and
you
more
do
of
it.
these forks in the road, and you just get better at that. But
Keep failing.
that's the choice. Exploration, exploitation is another way to think about it.
Thank you very much indeed for being a wonderfully patient and interactive audience. It is hugely appreciated. Manu, we are delighted that you were able to join us this evening.